Welcome back to Your 1230, the only podcast where our guests tell their story with the help of 12 questions in just 30 minutes. I'm your host, Mike Salitro, and today we are very excited to be joined by Mike Ulmer. Mike is the CEO of Catapult Bookwriting and the author of books about business, hockey, Canada, and leadership. His latest, Show and Tell Writing, a great short business book about how to write a great short business book, is available now. Mike, welcome. We are really thrilled to be speaking with you.
Oh, thank you. And I'm thrilled too. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. And I actually want to start with the book. Uh, Great title there. How did you come up with it? And was it was it the working title, or did you kind of work your way into it?
Oh, that's a great question, Mike. The well, I always tell my clients, because I have a book in which I help business in which I help people write their books. I always tell my clients, name the baby last, because if you want to throw the baby out, it's much harder with a name. Same reason farmers don't name their cattle. So, um, so the idea sort of just came to me on a whim. But the idea of sort of show and tell writing, I've always sort of been interested in the mechanics of it. And I came to realize there's some show and some tell, some exposition and some stuff that's not, because we are built to observe. And if I tell you something, or if you see something, you're far more likely to believe it if you see it. And so the power of that in writing is, if I tell you something without telling you, if I give you an example of something that I did and you observe that that shows a particular quality, you'll make that decision. You'll say, well, this guy's really courageous or wise or frugal or whatever. Whereas if I tell you you're frugal, I'm frugal or I'm wise or prudent or whatever those things, you're far less likely to believe it. So the book is about sort of it's kind of a writing lesson book, but it's about the juxtaposition between showing and telling.
And I told you before we started recording that enjoyed the book, which I really did.
Oh,
And
thank you.
part of it, it goes hand in hand with my background is as a journalism student way back. And if I was asked about it in some 20 years removed now,
Yeah.
my instinct is to remember, yes, with writing, it's very important to show, not tell. But that's what I really enjoyed about the book. It was the show and tell piece. And then as you described there, it makes sense as to why you do it. That you certainly don't want to just tell your story, because you're frugal doesn't not the same as that amazing story, but sometimes
Yeah.
you do it to fill in the pieces, and your book is excellent in kind of making that point come across that you do need both.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Yeah, it's absolutely true. I find the best art is when you're just slightly ahead of the teller. Maybe they call that sometimes an unreliable narrator. But you know, I have one particular movie I'm very fond of. The name of the movie is Harvey. It's from 1950. You haven't seen it, Mike, so because it's in
I'm not
black
even
and
going to
white.
lie to you, I
Right?
have not seen it.
It's about this guy who believes he sees a 6.5 foot rabbit, but he believes that the rabbit is far more interesting than he is, and but he channels so much love of his love that he thinks is coming from the rabbit, but actually is coming from him. And then he realizes that people seldom come twice for the conversation, because he tries to tell him about the rabbit. And so he doesn't get what we get, that it's really about his qualities and his love that's transmuted through him. And so that happens all the time, I think, in art. You get it just a minute before the person that you're listening to or watching gets it. You know what I mean? You know that feeling? And it's so powerful when you have that. So that moment of discovery really is really powerful for a listener or a reader. And so if they can have that, if they can see that and they can figure it out before you tell them, or even figure it out and you never have to tell them, man, that's money.
So I certainly was not the before piece of this, but after listening to the book, i I made the, we'll call it a conclusion. I could be wrong. You tell me, because we have not talked about this. But
Sure.
part of the book, Show and Tell, was it's a how-to guide, and the book itself is I'm going to show in your book. This is how it's. I'm going to tell you how I'm doing it, but also my book is the show piece of it. So I thought that
Yeah.
was really well done. That it was like, here is a live example, and with you lending your voice, I feel like it's the writing, it's the audio, it's all coming together. How did you decide that that was a good format to get that lesson across? I think that's a really hard thing to do, kind of accomplish all of those things in one.
Oh, yeah, and I know just what you mean, because I've sort of grappled with it from my I have a podcast. It's called Radio U, and so it's the podcast is I would be speaking with you, Mike, and then I would sort of jump in, sort of burst that fourth wall, and talk about what I was thinking while I asked that question. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
tampering with the fourth wall is really hard. It's really, really hard. So I completely agree with you that it's really, really tricky. I don't have a set answer for that. I just think that you just have to try your hardest. But when you're explaining to something what you're doing, something if you're explaining, if I'm explaining to a listener what I'm doing is I'm speaking to you, that's a juggle, man. Because who do you listen to? Do you listen to the interviewer? Do you listen to the subject? Do you listen to my side? Oh, pardon me, my side. So that's a tough one. That's a tough one. I hope I did it okay in the book, but that's a tough one.
You certainly did.
Oh,
There's excellent anecdotes in there, and they kind of tie hand in hand what we talked about up top when I introduced you. Um, Business Hockey Canada leadership. Sometimes business leadership, you see that fairly common. You'll see hockey in Canada tied together pretty often, but rarely will you see all four together.
yes.
Is there a hierarchy, or how have you decided to be labeled as I'm the guy who does these things?
Well, um, yeah. So the one that just jumps out of there, you got hockey and business and leadership. Well, the first, the leadership and the hockey kind of go together. The business thing is kind of a weird thing with me, Mike, in that I left. That was my business. I wrote about hockey and basketball. I worked for the people that own the Leafs and Raptors. And so I did a lot of that. And then I wrote a book about Canada, an alphabet book about Canada called M is for Maple. And geez, we sold 160,000 of those books. It's the number one alphabet book in Canada in Canadian publishing, which I'm really proud of.
As you should
And
be.
and so and then so the leadership part of it came after I left my employer, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I knew I was 53 years old, and I knew I was never going to get hired again because media is contracting. As you know, you were so smart to get out of it when you did way 20 years ago. Media is contracting, and so I spent pretty well 10 years trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And one of the real fulcrum points for that was when I went to a group that's called Business Networking International. I know they have them in the States too. It's sort of a networking group. And I sat with people because I never viewed myself as an entrepreneur. I viewed myself as a reporter and a journalist. And then that was gone. And I came to really see really quickly that there's this cohort of people who've been doing this that I didn't even know. They're like this, when you walk around downtown Boston, there's those malls underground. They're like that underground mall that I never knew existed. And I walked over every day. And these people are hustling, you know? They don't have a guaranteed paycheck or a benefit plan. They're living on their wits. They're figuring it out. And they don't know from one day to the next how this is all going to pan out. And so I met them as if meeting them for the first time. And I was so impressed. I just was so taken by the idea of the entrepreneurial life and how hard it is and how much courage it requires. So I started talking to them. I joined this group, and I realized none of them knew their stories, and they had such great stories, right? And I realized none of them knew, and so I was drawn to business and have been. So I write business books, but every book is a business book, and every business book is a biography. Because to have a great business book, you have to sort of be vulnerable and share your route. And so I just love business, and I came to it so late. So that's my latest thing. Really, the hockey and the Canadian stuff and the other stuff, the leadership and the business is the new stuff, and I'm fascinated by it.
So I want to follow up on a lot of that you said there, but I'll start at the end. Every book
Yeah.
is a business book. What do you mean by that?
Well, either you want to make your business writing books, or you want to write a book that makes people want to buy what you do. I mean, there's really just the two, right? So I think every business book is a business book. Every book is a business book for that very reason. And I think every business book is a biography, autobiography in this case, because to really, really, really have a powerful message, you have to give a backstory. So every great business book has three principles. It has the proposition, which is a great idea. It's counterintuitive, but it's a great idea. It has the backstory that validates the proposition. So nobody cares about my story, Mike. They probably care about yours, but no one cares about mine. But a lot of people can benefit from my conclusions. I'm not in the story business. I'm in the conclusions business. Because while a story can amuse and entertain you for a minute, a conclusion is something you can use for the rest of your life. So there's the proposition, there's the backstory that feeds the proposition, and then there's all the advice that you can give people. If you have those three, you have a great book and you have a great story. So helping people find those is what I do, but they're three very interconnected things.
So working with authors or first time authors or people who are telling stories do
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
do you find that they they're aware of the stories that they have, that they know that there's something in there, they just can't find it, or that most people, I would feel like myself, I've got nothing to talk about, and I don't think there's anything here to write.
Yeah. And I think everyone feels that way. Let me tell you a story. When I was a kid, this is how my dad walked our dog. He would put the dog in the back of the car. He would drive to a little gravel road about 10 minutes from our house. He would take the dog out. He'd put the dog on the gravel road and he would slowly drive away. Right. That was his version of walking the dog. Right. That's nuts. Right. But for a while, when I was a little kid and I'd see people walking their dogs, I would say, man, those poor people can't afford a car. Right. Now, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not totally. My point is, whatever you think happened to you is normal, is not necessarily normal to other people. I was talking to a woman today. She was just great, and we were talking about estate planning, and so she got into estate planning because she had this wonderful grandma. She's from the South. She lives in Mississippi. Her grandmother was a wonderful woman. When people go to revivals, this is Mississippi, they would go to revivals. After the revivals, they'd stop in and eat at her place because she just always had a great spread for people. She was a lovely, lovely woman. And when the woman, when her grandmother and her grandfather died, it set up a situation where people started scrambling for the money, and the family disintegrated. And her job now is to counsel people on wealth management to avoid what happened to her. Right? She probably doesn't think she has a great story. She doesn't think she has a great story. But believe me, everyone has a great story. And the reason they do, and I've talked to more than 10,000 people, Mike, and I've yet to find the person who didn't have a great story. So maybe it's out there, but I haven't found it yet. The reason we think we haven't had a great story, though, is because what we think would happen to us is normal, whereas none of us ever had a normal life, and none of us ever will. And it's those things that when you look at and someone helps you figure it out, people have likened it a bit to therapy, and I'm not a trained therapist, but if you have someone asking you a question that you hadn't considered, a story will emerge. Can I give you an example? I know we were supposed to do
Please.
30 minutes, but so I did a book by a guy named Ron Foxcroft. Great guy. He invented this whistle, this really loud whistle. It's in all the leagues, all the sports leagues all over the world. And he's a great guy, a great entrepreneur, just a super guy. Tons of stories, right? So I was talking to Ron later on in the later stages of our conversation, and I said, "I notice you don't drink." And he said, "No, I don't." And I said, "Okay, who is the alcoholic in your family? Because if you don't drink, there's just two reasons: you don't like the taste, or there's an alcoholic in your family, in your house, or in your orbit." And he said, "It was my dad." He said he used to beat me every week, and he beat me because he was angry, and he was angry because he was someone who had potential, and he just let it slip away. He was always a negative thinking person. He was the guy that always said woulda, coulda, shoulda. And I decided when I was a really young kid, I wasn't going to be like my dad. I wasn't going to drink, and I was never going to say woulda, coulda, shoulda. Okay. That's a story that you would never tell someone unless they asked, right? And unless they had the instinct and the experience to ask in particular. But that story, that little story, explains why at 75, this guy's still working his ass off. He's still working in the shadow of his father, right? He was never going to be that guy, and he's still not that guy. Well, that story is really powerful. So, is that a normal life? I don't know, but it's a profound way to explain why he is and how he is. Maybe he doesn't think maybe he doesn't think this is unusual. How do I know? But the power of the story is what breaks the notion that I don't have a story. Because Mike, you do have a story.
Okay. I think that you tell it in a compelling way that we all to be our own authentic selves, that no one else can be us, no one else knows our story. So our sense of normal is thrown off. And then in that we can tell what has happened to us. We can show our stories and we had something to talk about.
Wait,
So
listen, if you have 10 minutes, I'll do it right now with you.
Uh, I'm going to stick to my questions here because I'm not going to let you turn this on me.
Good call. Don't
Uh,
let the guests wrestle the podcast from you. Good call.
but let's go back to the alphabet book. M is for Maple. How did that happen?
Oh man, I wasn't very smart on that. I'd written a couple of hockey books, and I wish I could say there was a plan, Mike. They came to me and said, "We want you to write this alphabet book," because I'd written this hockey book that's like 6 people read, and and um, and I said no. And they said, "Come on." I said, "No, I'm busy." No. They said, "Come to Chelsea, Michigan, where the Jeff Daniels lives, and we'll buy you lunch." So I drove to Chelsea because I was curious. I'm much more amenable when they buy me lunch. I'm far more
Always helps.
agreeable. Yes, and I did the book. It was the best thing I ever did. Best thing I ever did. I did a bunch of other books, and it's. I kind of feel like the first line of my obituary is already written. You know, I could be hit by a bus tomorrow, and it'll be Mike Ulmer who wrote Emmons for Maple, because that book is in so many libraries, so many schools, and my employer was really great, and they let me go into schools and talk to kids about writing and about Canada. And so I was able to speak to thousands and thousands and thousands of kids about parts of our country, our history they didn't know, and about writing and storyboarding and all those things. And all that came from Mr. Maple. So I was so wrong. So when I talk to kids, I say, in terms of this stuff, in terms of adventures and in terms of projects, make your default yes. Don't make your default no. Make your default yes. You know, they say in improv, you know, there's 2 ways of attacking improv. One is no but, and the other one is yes and. Be a yes and person.
It's good advice, unless somebody on your podcast asks you to tell your story while you're asking questions.
And they turn out to be an expert.
No comment on that.
Yes.
What is the most common question the kids would ask you?
How did you get to be an author is a good one. It's funny because when you walk in, you know, and they look at you, they go, "You look like just like my dad." Obviously, anyone could do this, right? So a lot of them ones are about how did you get to be an author. Most of the time, it's that. Is it hard to write a book? Those are the 2 biggies. Yeah, those are the 2 big. And sometimes they ask, "How much money do you make?"
Those are all good kid questions. So
Those
I
are
see
all
it.
good, quick questions. Yeah, I agree.
But I don't want to skip over. I want to ask you about this.
Sure.
Covering the Leafs, covering the Raptors.
Yeah.
Were you a sports fan growing up? I recall hockey, yes, but what was the sport of your choice as a child?
Oh, I was a big baseball fan. I grew up a big fan of the Detroit Tigers, and loved going to. My hometown, sorry, was an hour away from Tiger Stadium, and I was a big baseball fan. But I liked hockey too. And are you a hockey fan, Mike?
I follow the sport. I would not classify myself as a fan at this point.
Okay, fair
No,
enough.
for no reason to that I don't follow it very closely. It's a
No,
great
that's
sport.
okay. But hockey is obviously it's pretty big here. The Maple Leafs were sort of are really they're, you know, they'd be sort of like the Red Sox or the Yankees, right, in terms of the hierarchy. And I just always wanted to be the guy in the press box covering them. When I was a kid, I read stacks and stacks of Sports Illustrated. A lot of sports writers of my vintage really got tons and tons of magazines and sat down and write them. I know 3 or 4 guys that just read Sports Illustrated. It's a very influential magazine in terms of the style of sports writing, and it influenced me and a bunch of other people. And I just but the route there was not far from assured or easy, but I ended up getting there. And I just love hockey. Hockey players are great. They're often really down to earth people, and it's not a Canadian American thing or a European thing. It's just that, and it's changing now because in Canada and the U.S., it's become a rich kid's sport because it's really expensive, the equipment and the ice time and the driving. So you get a different kind of kid. But when I got started, there were still kids that were like off the farm, you know, and the most decent, straight shooting people you ever meet. A lot of times, the tough guys, the guys that fight for a living, are the most direct. One guy wrote children's books, are the most direct, kind people. And so I just love hockey, and I've loved it since for my whole life. I quit this year, though. I walked away from it this year. I decided I didn't want to follow the Leafs anymore. 50 years, and I worked for them. And it was 50 years. I remember the day I decided to be a Leaf fan. And I started as a Montreal Canadian fan. And that was 1973, long before you were born, Mike. And the Canadiens beat the Bruins, sad to say, in 7 games. Ken Dryden was the goalie. And they won. They beat Minnesota in 6, and then they won in Chicago in 7. They were down 2-0 in Game 7. Jacques Lemaire, remember that Tony Esposito, the Blackhawks goalie, was nearsighted. He beat him from a shot from center ice. Henri Richard, who'd gotten into a real scrap with the coach, scored the winning goal, and they won 3-2. And I said, well, this is it. This is my team. Because in the sports business, you recognize that kids brand themselves at 13 years old, 14 years old. Whoever the team is they first notice and love and cheer for, that's it. They never, ever, ever change. So there's a lot of kids walking around Pittsburgh Penguins fans because they saw Sidney Crosby win the Stanley Cup whatever that year was. So they brand themselves. And I branded myself. I was ready to be a Canadiens fan. And then they fired the coach. They won the Stanley Cup and they fired their coach. And I said, these guys are assholes. I'm out. I'm out. I quit the Montreal Canadiens for the Toronto Maple Leafs. I have made some bad decisions in my life, Michael. But that one,
at least it's a principled decision.
Them all.
That's okay. You had it. You had your reason for it. It's a good principle. I did not realize that they fired their coach the year they won the Stanley Cup. So that's a pretty that's an okay reason to walk away, even if they've won a handful of cups since, and Montreal, Toronto has not. So
5, as a matter of fact. But who's counting?
No,
yes.
Who's counting?
I was working the last one. My brother-in-laws were there, and we were in the car, and Montreal was going crazy, and I was covering the finals, and I got tickets for my brother-in-laws, and they're both Canadiens fans. They were so disgustingly happy. And I got in the car, and I said to them, you sons of bitches, I hope you enjoyed this, because this is the last time this is ever going to happen in your lifetimes. And so far, so good.
Well, they've heeded the warning there, and they've not sniffed it again. But being a pretty passionate sports fan, did that help, or how did that impact your career? I would think that that's, for most people who go into a line of business or to just take a job, they have not been thinking about it since they were 13. What was that like?
That was really neat because I did it because I was, I took 3 years at a 2-year community college course. I spent 7 years at a weekly newspaper, 7 years in this little town, writing about county fairs. And it was a long, long journey. And to get there, to be there for these events, to meet a lot of really exemplary people. I wrote a lot about the game's history. I got to meet Rocket Richard, right? I got to sit in the conversation with him, just him and me, It became problematic because once you've interviewed Maurice Richard, it's really hard to wait for Phil Kessel. but I got to do so many great things. I was so lucky. But what made me different was, while I was I was a fan, and then you stop being a fan. I can't cheer or jump up or do anything now. I still, when I watch sports, you stop being a fan because your job is the story, But it was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful time. I was really, really lucky to do it.
It's a good answer. It's a good answer. As I look up and we're somehow nearing time.
No, I'm going to break your formula.
Having the ability to talk to as many people as you have, children, athletes, aspiring authors, what is one thing that you find either surprising to you or that's common between those groups that you're teaching them that they're not aware of, that, hey, I'm impacting all these different people, and what seems like common sense or it seems like something everybody should know, I just keep finding out they don't. People want to break into writing about sports, or even when you're talking with kids, anything that you find is common that you're telling them or that they may not know that makes sense as advice to all those groups.
Okay, well, the one I often tell young kids is that a couple of things. First, just because you write something doesn't necessarily mean that you're done. So this is what I would do with the kids. Okay, are you with me, Mike? This is what I would do with the kids. I'm just going to move around a little bit here for you. And I would say to the kids, do I have a bald spot? And they would go, yeah. And I would go, come on, stop kidding around. Do I have a bald spot? And they would go, yeah. And I would say, come on, quit. Do I have a bald spot? And they would say, the third time, the kids are always yelling, right? Yeah, you have a bald spot. Yeah, you do. And I would say, well, that's weird because I can't see it when I brush my teeth in the morning. That's what an editor does. You can't see it when you brush your teeth in the morning, but the editor can see what you can't see in your stories, in your work. So all great writing has great editors. That's the first thing I tell them. The second thing I tell them is that people will tell you anything. So I give them homework. I would say, go and ask your parents about how they met, or when they came to Canada, or the time that they almost were killed. Because everyone's got one of those three stories. Everyone's been in a close call. You're thinking right now, I can see right now how you met your wife, how you came to Canada, or the time you almost got, and I know you've got to start. You've got one. You don't have to tell me what it is, but you've got one, right?
All your questions listed what would be my answers. So those are excellent questions.
And so when you ask those questions, look the person right in the eye, right? And then give them sounds that you're listening, and then listen with your entire body. Listen, not just with your ears, your eyes, but with your entire body. Let their answers come into your body. You're concentrating that hard. And then when they're talking to you, make little sounds. Okay. And sometimes even look at the ground, because what you're telling the speaker then is you're concentrating so hard that you're not even looking at them. You're just working so hard at concentrating. And then the third part of that is ask them questions based on their answers. If you do those three things, look them in the eye, listen with your whole body, and ask questions based on your answers, people will tell you anything. And it's true. They will. Regularly, a lot of times I would interview one of their teachers on the time, and inevitably the teacher would be saying, geez, the only person I ever told that was my wife, which is kind of fun to hear. So those are three things that I would absolutely tell any person: eye contact, listening, and follow-up questions based on that. The gold, and Mike, you knew this as a journalist, the gold lies in the third question. What's your name? Mike. What do you do? Podcast. Why did you decide to do that, Mike? That's where the gold is, right? It's the third question.
It's when someone tells you that, I've never told anybody this before, you're listening intently and you're following up with the right question. So it's wonderful, wonderful advice, and you illustrate it well.
Well, it's honored. You're honored that the fact that some person would do that, and especially a teacher surrounded by his class, and I would often turn to the kids and I would say, do you know that about your teacher? And they would go, no. And I would say, how is it that I know that about your teacher and you don't? And they said, well, you asked. And I would say, exactly.
So where can our listeners find you or connect with you, Mike, if they want to hear more?
Oh, yes. Well, my website is called MikeUlmer.com, not coincidentally. And my business is I help people find their stories. We write a lot of books with people. I help them write their books. Either they write it, and we coach them through it, or we write them for them. But we have a lot of people that are like podcasters and stuff like that, such as yourself, and they're looking for that story, that one thing, and they want to know how to tell it, what the proposition is, what the backstory is, and what their advice is. So we help people find that as well. So I am doing a podcast. It's brand new. I only have one up, and it's called Radio U with Mike Ulmer. And that one's available at all the usual channels.
Very nice. We will post all of that. Let's get out of here on this. I am very good at jumping around, not always asking sequential questions. Is there anything
that's what you want.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that I probably should have?
Yeah. What's the capital of North Dakota?
Bismarck is in my mind, and I'm pretty sure that's wrong. So
well done. Bismarck, North Dakota is correct.
All right, we'll take it.
You are a grand prize winner. Well done, Mike. No, your questions were great. Your questions were terrific. I really enjoyed this.
We will take that, and it was very, very fun speaking with you. I look forward to doing this again, and good luck with the new show.
Well, thank you for thinking of me. I was thrilled to talk with you.
You got it.